Welcome everyone, this is Angel Miller with peopleofshambhala.com. Thanks for tuning in. This week I wanted to talk about esotericism and civilization. Frithjof Schuon, a spiritual thinker and traditionalist in the line of René Guénon, said that the Western mentality, quote, in its positive qualities, is almost entirely of Christian essence, unquote. Now you may take issue with that. It's something that can be debated. What's interesting in regards to Schuon is he combines this statement with another in which he says, quote, Christianity cannot be exoteric in the usual sense of the word, unquote. Now, if it is true, as Schuon suggests, that the Western mentality in its positive qualities is almost entirely of Christian essence, and if Christianity is not exoteric in the usual sense of the word, we could conclude, and I think it's the only logical conclusion, that the Western mentality or Western civilization is in some way not exoteric. It is in some way esoteric. And I think that actually bears out quite well, although there are certain issues with that. Esotericism is a complicated subject, and we'll get on to what it is in a little while. But the reason Schuon claims essentially that Christianity is a kind of esoteric religion is that it contrasts Judaism, which was, at least at some point, very much involved with the idea of law, and Jesus' teachings seem to be a rejection of that. For example, he tells his followers to reject the law notion of an eye for an eye. If somebody does something, you under the law can do something back of equivalence. And he says to reject that. In fact, he says, resist not evil. And if somebody smites you on the right cheek, turn to him the left also. And he says if somebody steals your coat, then give him also your cloak. Now, you can't really build a foreign policy on that. You can't really build a policy of law and order on that. It's simply impossible. And the way that Western civilization has got around that is to introduce other things into civilization, or into Western civilization. The Catholic Church, for example, reintroduced Plato and Aristotle as part of its learning for, at least for the more educated of the Church. It reintroduced the notion of natural law, which has some roots in ancient Greek philosophy. And even later on, really into modern times, for example, the better or the elite schools of Great Britain and probably the elite schools of Europe also taught ancient Greek philosophy and this sort of thing. And it's probably because, not just because that may be the root of Western civilization to a very large extent, but also because Christianity doesn't really furnish people with a kind of exoteric framework. You just can't build laws on it, really. You can't build a law and order policy. You can't really build a defense policy on it. And at some point, people educated in elite schools may well be creating such policies in government. And Greek mythology, and more especially Greek philosophy, has provided some way around that. It's provided a kind of exoteric framework for this more esoteric, this more inner, at least, this more sort of spiritual teaching of Jesus. And by the way, I'm not a Christian, and I'm not defending Christianity, and I'm not attacking Christianity either. I'm just making observations about what Western civilization is or appears to be. Now, is the West an esoteric civilization? In one regard, it does seem to have an inherent degree of esotericism, and that is, it seems to be involved to a very great degree in interpretation and reinterpretation and pushing ideas to their limits. And this is not necessarily something that you find in every other culture at all, and we should acknowledge that. In another sense, it seems to lack a quality of esotericism in that Christianity, Western civilization, more completely, does not seem to be very involved in techniques of spirituality, whereas in Hindu spirituality or Islamic spirituality, there most certainly are techniques of raising the consciousness, of, as it were, of transcendence, of entering into other states of consciousness. And this isn't something that we typically find with Christianity, unless perhaps one looks at really quite obscure forms of Christian esotericism, perhaps Martinism or Christian Gnosticism, but these are really quite obscure movements. But it's interesting to me that of all the movements that have really become popular in the West, Freemasonry is by far the most important, spiritually speaking, in terms of numbers anyway. Mircea Eliade, the great anthropologist, said, quote, "The only secret movement that exhibits a certain degree of ideological consistency, already has a history, and enjoys social and political prestige is Freemasonry," unquote. Well, we might take issue with Freemasonry having political prestige, but certainly it has some social prestige, at least historically. And what's interesting about Freemasonry as an esoteric movement, and it certainly is esoteric, there's no two ways about it, but it, like Christianity, does not really have techniques of transcendence. Now, it is true, of course, that there are prayers in the lodge, but these do not really compare to, in terms of transcendental consciousness-altering qualities, as meditations on the chakras or something like that. Now, it's not to say that they're not entirely valid and valuable, but the practitioner within the lodge does not really change his consciousness in the same way that a Hindu tantrika or a Hindu esotericist or a Sufi or Shia esotericist might. And Freemasonry is to a very large degree based on the interpretation and the reinterpretation of symbols. And it itself is a very interesting phenomenon, and it certainly lies at the root of the New Age phenomenon and this sort of multicultural spirituality that we see today in the West. Historically, I think that's absolutely the case, and very easily provable. Of course, the fraternity was founded in the early 18th century, and originally, despite what many Freemasons claim today, it was essentially Christian. And Freemasons were obliged to believe in the religion that all men agree, leaving the denominations to themselves. But the religion which they all agreed in at that time was Christianity, and later on it became much more open. Over a fairly long period, Jews were initiated a couple of decades after it was founded, and in the middle of the 19th century, and this was certainly a very progressive act at the time, Hindus and Muslims began to be initiated as well in India, and there was a big controversy about that, and it was not an easy transition. Some Freemasons felt that Hindus and Muslims should be initiated, and some others were more resistant to that, but ultimately they were, and that's an important point in the history of Freemasonry. But Freemasonry does posit itself as a kind of esotericism related to the religion of the practitioner, in that practitioners are supposed to practice their own religion, whether it's Christianity or Hinduism or what have you. And Freemasonry does not regard itself as a kind of religion in itself, but as a kind of esotericism. That said, the original religion was Christianity, and many of the symbols clearly relate to it or related to it at one time. But Freemasonry does also have a kind of exoteric foundation as well, so it is nevertheless quite self-contained Its rituals are clearly based on natural law theory, although this is never mentioned. And of course there is the presence of this volume of sacred law, that is to say a holy book, as well, during the working of the lodge. So in essence, esotericism is based on three things, I would argue. One is the interpretation of texts, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita or so on. The second one is techniques of spiritual realization, of changing the consciousness, usually in a fairly direct way. And thirdly is the notion of transcendence itself, of a raising up of the initiate to so that he achieves a higher state of consciousness. Now, of course, there's nothing easier than saying higher consciousness, and we'll speak about what that means in a little while. But essentially, esotericism requires the interpretation of a holy text, or a text regarded as sacred, as written by God, and so on. The notion of transcendence, of reaching up to the higher, and techniques to raise oneself up. The other factor, of course, is that esotericism is related to the exoteric. As I mentioned in Freemasonry, there's a notion of natural law, there's the holy book, which is always present, and the practice of the exoteric religion by the initiate, whatever religion that may be. So it's clearly related to the exoteric, and that's an important, if not essential, aspect of esotericism. I think a lot of esotericists today believe that if they have techniques and some kind of notion of transcendence or of altering the consciousness, that is esotericism. And I think in a way it's actually more of a kind of exotericism. It's actually a kind of religious phenomenon. It isn't necessarily esotericism in itself. There's no outer form, so in itself it becomes the outer form, and there's no real place to go beyond that. Esotericism is a reaching out beyond and a reaching out within, and of course reaching higher. In terms of civilization, the West is certainly very interesting, because for all the talk of America or the West being a Christian civilization, and of course that is true to a very large extent, and historically for the last 1,000 years, maybe a little bit more, Christianity really has been the religion, even considering the influence of pre-Christian religions on Christianity, especially on Catholicism, of course, which absorbed a lot of the Germanic pre-Christian religion, its symbols, its festival dates, and so on. But Christianity has been a huge influence on civilization in the West. But nevertheless, there are some very interesting phenomena that we see. Of course, George Washington, the first president of the USA, was a Freemason, and a lot of people look at that in a very conspiratorial light, thinking that the Freemasons are some kind of secret world government. That's ridiculous. That's just nonsense. But it is true that he was a Freemason, and it's also true that he actually took Freemasonry very seriously. His officers were required to be Freemasons, not because of any kind of nepotism, but because he believed that the values of Freemasonry and the experience of Freemasonry inculcated in people, in men, qualities that were of use in times of war, and qualities that were of use for people in roles of leadership, who had to inspire other men. And there are other figures as well, of course. Winston Churchill belonged to a Druid order in his youth. He also belonged to the Freemasons as well, but wasn't very active and didn't go very many times. I don't think it was very significant in his life, but he was a Druid. This certainly was a fraternity, not necessarily an especially esoteric or spiritual group. But it's interesting that somebody who had such a background would be involved in this sort of thing. And of course, if we go further back, Sir Isaac Newton, undoubtedly the world's most famous scientist, was involved in alchemy and in Christian esotericism in a quite unusual sense. He drew out a plan of Solomon's temple as he perceived it and used it to try and make predictions. It seems a rather cranky way of doing that, but he believed through this plan of Solomon's temple he would be able to see future events or predict future events. It's not really the kind of image we have of Sir Isaac Newton as a sort of purely rational thinker. And there are many interesting people that we can think of that have been in some way involved in the esoteric or influenced by esotericism, from Mozart, who was extremely influenced by Freemasonry, to movie maker Kenneth Anger, who has been inspired by occultist Aleister Crowley. There's certainly a big range of people out there of varying historical and cultural importance. William Blake would certainly be another figure. He was influenced by Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedish mystic, Christian mystic, who claimed to speak with angels. And the words of one of his poems was later used for the words of the song Jerusalem, which has been called England's unofficial national anthem. And this poem itself was influenced by the ideas and the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, and it's startling in a way that you could have a quote-unquote unofficial national anthem of a country, in this case England, so obviously influenced by Christian esotericism, and yet it be really unknown, completely unknown to the general public, and I'm sure as well to politicians and those that have called for it in recent years to be made the actual official anthem of the country. But it goes to show to what degree esotericism really has affected Western culture outside or sometimes within Christianity. And today, and perhaps for the last several decades, although I think it's really become much more apparent and much more the case in the last 10 years or so, you have a kind of spiritual movements that have combined with political ones. And this is most especially the case on the left, perhaps really on the left of the left, the more socialist end, the more anarchist end. And that certainly exists. A lot of people claim that it doesn't, but it it certainly does. And you have something like Occupy Wall Street, which I've mentioned a couple of times before, where you have meditation, yoga, an altar dedicated to the deities of all the different religions, at least all the ones they could think of, and yet at the same time is calling for political change on a national and possibly even on an international level. And you also have this, as I've mentioned before, on the far right. You don't get it on the mainstream or center-right, and that's because Christianity, mainstream Christianity, is very much a part of center-right Republican politics. You're not going to get people in the Republican Party or even supporters of the Republican Party, normally anyway, being into Aleister Crowley, but that's not necessarily the case on some fringes of the far right. There is that phenomenon as well. And this is interesting because what a lot of these spiritual practitioners do is, because they don't really have an exoteric framework, and I've been talking about the importance of having an exoteric framework for the practice of esotericism, they will essentially turn politics into the exoteric, so that, on the left or the far left, equality will become part of the way of thinking about the world, or perhaps other things. Mass immigration or environmentalism is a big issue now on the left, and this will all become part and parcel of a spiritual worldview. And in a sense, it will become spiritualized through the application of techniques, in a sense, kind of homogenize the spiritual and the political. And on the far right, you have the same phenomenon. So maybe inequality would be the worldview that they would adopt. They don't seem to be quite as interested in meditation and this sort of thing. Generally speaking, it may be that they're interested in some of the more politically incorrect ideas of Aleister Crowley, who incidentally actually lauded feudalism as a desirable system in his Confessions. So he's not quite the hippie that he's often made out to be, but he's a complex and controversial and contradictory character in many ways. He's not easily understood. And in fact, Crowley even regarded himself as preserving what was worth preserving in traditional or ancient culture. He didn't really view himself as a progressive or anything like this, although much of his behavior, his bisexuality, his drug taking, would be viewed in the contemporary world as very progressive behavior. But Crowley is an interesting character. And Crowley is a good segue, I think, into another aspect of the relationship between the exoteric and the esoteric. And it's not simply that the esoteric is somehow slavishly dependent upon the exoteric. The inner isn't dependent on the outer, although in certain respects it certainly is. But in another sense, the esoteric is also going beyond, and in some respects even a challenging of the exoteric. And Crowley, of course, very much challenged convention in his own time, and would probably challenge convention in the contemporary world, although perhaps for very different reasons. I've mentioned his more politically incorrect views. And the West is very interesting, and they go through these very faddish phases of liking or appreciating or knowing about different religions and spirituality, and often for very much the wrong reasons. You may remember about 15 years ago there was a big fad for Zen Buddhism, and if you asked people what they liked about Zen Buddhism, they would tell you that it was the sort of rule breaking, that the Zen Buddhist monks would spit at images of the Buddha or would smash statues of the Buddha because essentially they were anarchists and they didn't believe in the rules and all this kind of thing. And to be frank, this is just complete nonsense. Zen Buddhism has that aspect because Zen Buddhism took root in a very traditional, very rules-based society, Japan, and was very much became very much a part and parcel of everyday life and different vocations and professions, everything from flower arranging to the samurai and martial arts and war. And when Zen Buddhism talks about breaking the rules, what it's essentially saying is to go beyond them. It's not saying that you don't obey the rules, that you don't learn the rules. It's implied, it's assumed that you will have learned the rules, whether it's the rules of martial arts or the rules of painting or the rules of flower arranging or the rules of serving tea. And anyone who's ever participated or even seen a Japanese tea ceremony will understand that this more traditional, more feudal, more medieval Japan was extraordinarily rules-bound. The tea ceremony can last 20 minutes or maybe an hour or maybe longer than that, and the etiquette is extraordinary and is a very involved process. It's not like handing somebody a cup of coffee from Starbucks. And if Zen Buddhism had washed up on the shores of 20th or 21st century America or Britain, perhaps, instead of medieval Japan, I can assure you it would not be emphasizing rule breaking, because there aren't really enough rules in the West to break. Now, if you've grown up in a small town in the Midwest, you may disagree. Perhaps your experience is that it's quite restrictive or oppressive. But even that would be nothing compared to medieval Japan. That's simply the case. And so Zen Buddhism, this idea of breaking the rules, is really going beyond the rules. You've learned the rules of painting, and at some point you just have to go beyond them, and consciously, or in your consciousness, you're simply going to do that. You'll no longer really remember the beginning lessons, or at least not consciously when you're painting. And at some point you're just going to go beyond them. And this is the case in martial arts, this is the case in flower arranging or whatever have you. And in the West, I think we do need to emphasize the rules a little bit more. And that's not necessarily a case of, I'm not suggesting necessarily the rules of law and order or anything like this, but I think spiritual practitioners, it's really essential that they involve themselves in things that have rules, such as martial arts or painting, and really learn those rules, really practice them, and then at a certain point then to leap off from that. And that's a long way down the line, and often Western practitioners will think that they can just break the rules immediately or after a couple of weeks. And anyone who's been to a sort of relatively artsy cafe will have seen sort of pretty bad art on the wall, usually sort of Picasso knockoffs. And in a way, I always admire the energy and enthusiasm of that. But it's always better to actually learn the rules, to know why you're breaking them, and in a way how to break them, just how to go beyond it. In the Hindu tantric tradition, the left-hand tantric tradition, there is a ritual called the Panchamakara. It's usually referred to as the ritual of the 5 M's, because it refers to 5 substances which are consumed: Maithuna, Mada, Mamsa, Matsya, and Mudra, sexual union, wine, meat, fish, parched grain, or money. And these are prohibited in Hindu society, but they're nevertheless offered up, in some respects prohibited, but they're offered up to the deity as a way of sort of transforming them and transforming the consciousness. It would be very difficult to do that in Western society today. I mean, I don't think there's anything that is really taboo, and becoming less and less so. And I think one of the interesting things that's going to happen is that you're going to have eventually a more conservative society in some respects, especially as it becomes more multi-religious, because although Westerners think that all religions, with the exception of Christianity, are sort of spiritual and left-wing, they're really not. Even Buddhism, practiced in Buddhist countries, is not really, in fact, it's not at all about sort of tuning in and dropping out. It's really about rules of sexual behavior, not abusing people, not getting drunk, not lying, not stealing, and so on and so forth. And that is the exoteric view. Those are the eternal values that hold a society together, and the people need, really, not just run-of-the-mill ordinary people, but even esotericists, of course, need there to be this kind of stability where there's not abuse of people, where there's not lying. I mean, of course, these things go on, but even esotericists need them to be taboo and prohibited, and these eternal values are what allow the esotericists to go deeper in a way, or higher, but they are essential and they have to be there. But what we see in the West, as I mentioned, is a rejection of eternal values, and instead a kind of spiritualization of political parties or political movements. In a sense, you have a kind of spiritual democratic party or a spiritual far right. But certainly the left wing is much, much bigger than the far right one. I mean, that's pretty tiny. But the replacement of eternal values for political vogue is a dangerous thing to do. Political parties change, political movements change, and their ideas change. And certainly, if we look at the left and right over the last 100 years, Some of their views have changed places. What was left-wing is now right-wing. What was once right-wing is now left-wing. And ideas that are regarded as progressive in one decade may be regarded as reactionary in another, and vice versa. Today, for example, the left is much more cautious about criticizing religion and says it's something we shouldn't do, generally speaking. This would have been regarded as a crazy idea by left-wingers a century ago, and certainly 200 or 300 years ago. In Marxism, criticism of religion is regarded as the beginning of philosophy, and this is probably true of the left more broadly at a certain point in time. On the other hand, on the right, quote-unquote, now there is criticism of religion, especially Islam, it has to be said, maybe not so much other religions, but that is not a right-wing position. And of course on the left now you have much more interest in environmentalism. This was certainly once a very right-wing phenomenon. Only very right-wing governments 40, 50, 60 years ago were really environmentalist. The left saw itself as progressive. It wasn't interested in nature or conserving nature. Conserving is conservative, obviously. But now it's left-wing. And on the right again, although nearly always tied just to Islam, which the right is often very critical of, the mainstream right, that is. The right will often champion women's rights and gay rights. That's not a right-wing position, it's a left-wing position. And consequently, on a more practical level, there are strange kind of bedfellows on both the left and the right, sort of radical religious figures, and feminists and progressives on the left, and then maybe some actually far-right people, and then sort of old-fashioned liberals and feminists on the right as well. So it's curious, and I don't think these alliances can really last. Certainly they can't last more than a couple of decades, I would imagine. But the spiritualization of politics, or the politicization of spirituality, is in itself a bit of a dead end. And I think that the people in the West, serious practitioners, are going to start looking for more eternal values again. And I think that, in a way, serious spiritual practitioners can't really get around that. You're going to need to do that. And certainly we also see from various quarters suggestions that non-Western religious laws be introduced into the West. This is primarily the case with Wahhabi and Salafi Muslims, who are certainly a minority, a tiny minority at the moment, but certainly suggest that the West and certainly other countries adopt Sharia Islamic law. And there may be other offerings of this religious law as well, particularly with maybe with Hinduism and Buddhism and the notion of Dharma, which is really natural law. So these things are there, and some are better than others, it has to be said. But can we create an esoteric civilization? Well, the answer is yes, but in a way, although there is many more displays of spirituality now, and perhaps many more choices of spirituality in the world today, the Western world, in a certain sense, we may be heading away from an esoteric civilization. And that's because we don't really have the eternal values as an exoteric. An esoteric civilization, and even, I think, an authentic, initiatic, and esoteric society really requires understanding the exoteric, the external, eternal laws. And this is certainly something you see in Sufism. Some Sufi orders don't recognize Sharia, but many others actually do. And certainly in Hindu esotericism, there's an understanding of Dharma, that is natural law, and same with Buddhism as well. And I think that the West and Western esoteric associations are going to need to focus much more. This is just my personal opinion, but I think to be genuinely esoteric, I think the irony would be that these organizations and associations may end up focusing much more 20, 30, 40 years down the line on the exoteric, because that is what's missing in society today. Bookshops are dying, of course, but when there were more of them around, I used to be able to go into Barnes and Noble and pick up a copy of all the secret rituals of the Golden Dawn. But in a way, it's harder to get decent books on natural law or on the writings of Thomas Aquinas or something like that. That's what's tricky in this day and age. And certainly if we want to fix many of the problems that we see today with the environment, with religious fanaticism, of course it's a very much politicized types of fanaticism that we see. It's not necessarily genuinely religious, whether it's Islamism or Wahhabism or Christian Zionism. Of course it is very much a kind of religionized politics. But if we're going to solve these issues, or if we're going to be able to cope with them in the future, and other issues, as I mentioned, environmentalism, maybe animal welfare, a range of things, I think that the sort of spiritualization of political parties and political ideologies, it won't be enough. In a sense, we're going to need to know about personal conduct, or character, and so on, and aligning ourselves to natural law. What does it mean to be a spiritual practitioner if you stand against a violent individual and completely crumble? What does it mean to be spiritual if you really don't know how to behave in the world at all? If you're completely paralyzed even in social situations. Character is important, and developing the character is important, and that requires the exoteric. And in the future, as I say, the exoteric and the esoteric, the inner and the outer, the spiritual realization and eternal law are going to have to be, in a certain sense, mediated, and will have to be worked out together if we're going to create a better future. And that's certainly something I'm going to be talking about as time goes by, and hopefully getting a little more granular. But until then, thanks for tuning in, and I hope to speak to you soon.